The Victorian era is most often associated with ostentatious dresses and glitzy balls, but the crime was rife far from those enormous ballrooms in the city's dark and winding lanes. During those years, common thieves, expert and experienced pickpockets, and infamous killers like Jack the Ripper terrorized British citizens, driving security systems to excel and become more effective in the hunt for and punishment of these offenders. Unveiling the hidden crimes of Victorian London, where opulence masks a dark underworld of thieves and killers, are you prepared to be captivated by the chilling tales that lurk behind the grand facade? Pickpockets assembled in the most crowded areas of London, such as the streets of Newton, Dyot, or the parish of St. Giles, where they had an unending supply of potential victims. Racetracks, festivals, and museums were known to be the bases of most thieves and pickpockets in the city. These cunning thugs stalked wakes and executions alike. Even though the populace of Victorian London was sucked into the fear that the media promoted through sensationalism, there were few violent crimes, with only 10% of all crimes being violent and 75% being petty crimes that were either ignored because they were minor or not reported at all, with pickpocketing coming in at the top of the list. Racetracks, festivals, and museums were known to be the bases of most thieves and pickpockets in the city. These cunning thugs stalked wakes and executions alike. Even while men made up the majority of pickpockets, certain female pickpockets showed comparable talent, and in the case of Jenny Diver, superior wit. Jenny left for London when she was 15 years old, where she committed herself to death. Change from hard labor to hanging. Simply put, if someone commits something wrong, they must be punished. Whether you were a cold-blooded killer or a hungry, impoverished young man who dared to steal some bread out of desperation, the British authorities at that time made no distinction between gravity and circumstances. In some cases, not even age could keep any wretch from being imprisoned or hanging from a noose. If you committed the same act, you may only receive a minor warning or be executed immediately unless you were fluent in the language of money. Except for crimes like murder or treason, when you could only expect to be publicly hanged for amusing the populace while instilling fear, the wealthy could usually get away by practically any wrongdoing by paying a substantial sum. These public hangings were common practice at the start of the Victorian era, and spots like the Three-Legged Mare were designated where they could execute multiple inmates simultaneously in front of an audience that occasionally numbered 2,000 people. If you were more fortunate, if you could call it that, you would be sentenced to a prison where you would endure a lengthy period of arduous, repetitive labor, continual spanking, a wet cell, and little to no food or water, to the point where the inmates would scream for assistance from bystanders. The punishment of transportation was an alternative to being sent to prison. Early in the 20th century, as public opinion began to turn against the cruelty of the law, British authorities reduced executions, reserving them only for murder offenses, and improved prison conditions, putting more emphasis on rehabilitation than torture. The horrible prisons of Victorian times. Unless we discuss Norwegian jails, the situation is similar for the rest of us mortals, and none of us would enjoy being locked up. They would undoubtedly even choose to serve their time in one of our most understaffed jails or prisons, where at least they would have access to food and drink. The City of London had already become a refuge for violent and unpunished criminals by 1811. This may sound dramatic, but the city was now calm and safe. Those captured were kept in semicircular jails, like the one in Pentonville, where they were constantly whipped and forced to work hard all day. They used a separate system that forbade the inmates from having contact with other people and kept them confined to their cells, save for occasional exercise intervals. They gave them no food, had their faces covered, and forbade them from speaking because they thought this would make the prisoner think about his behavior. Criminals who committed minor offenses were deported to Britain's colonies and spread throughout the globe to perform forced labor. They came up with the idea to use old abandoned warships that they nicknamed hulks, when they could no longer lock them in their jails or send them away, and the wretched souls transported to these temporary confinements rarely managed to escape from their dark cells and wet walls. Executions conducted in public. What kind of executions took place in public during the 19th century? We all know that in ancient times, things were different. People did not live as long, either because the simple flu took them away, they died of hunger, or they were executed in various ways just for breathing next to the wrong person, either burned at the stake on accusations of witchcraft, or like Catherine Murphy in 1789, for being a counterfeiter. Throughout much of Britain's history, the law mandated the beheading, chopping into four, and even dismemberment of the condemned, although the gallows are the site of most executions. In Wales, Bishop Roland Lee executed more than 5,000 individuals in public just during the reign of Henry VIII. Up to the early 20th century, the pillory and its death sentence were used during the Victorian era. Until the late 19th century, these executions were public and enormously lucrative because many people were drawn in by what seemed to be a show. They were purportedly reserved for murderers, traitors, and repeat offenders. Sometimes the greatest spots to observe them were sold, and companies nearby experienced increased commercial activity while some poor sinner took his final breath. Typically, the condemned individual was driven in the back of a cart to the execution site. People loved tossing various objects at him while the journey was underway, including bad food. Also present were insulted, since they demanded that your final hours be the most miserable of your life. In April 1866, Swansea, a Welsh town, hosted one of the final public executions. At 18, Robert Coe was found guilty of murdering his buddy and co-worker. To obtain the 30 pieces of silver he was entitled to from his most recent payment, he took him to the bottom of Greg Driffin's forest and used an axe to decapitate him. The Victorian era's most notorious murders. Since the killer's identity behind those slayings was a mystery, we are all familiar with Jack the Ripper and his tale. It continues to be one of the most horrific crimes of all time. Top police riddle that has never been solved. In 1888, he targeted 5 ladies as his victims, slitting their necks, torturing them, and removing various parts with surgical precision. The authorities assumed that the offender had medical training as a result. Women appeared on the list of the worst murderers during this time, and boy, did they earn it. The Richmond killer, Kate Webster, worked as Julia Martha Thomas's maid. By throwing her down the stairs, strangling her, and ultimately dismembering and boiling her beyond recognition, she committed suicide. Amelia Dyer, a vicious individual who in 1869 was committed to the sale of newborns, was even worse. The women who had children their parents did not want were compelled to place them in Dyer's care in the hope that they would receive better treatment, unaware that most of them were giving away their chances at life. Approximately 400 newborns were starved to death, drugged or strangled, and dumped into the Tame River. This was brought to light when dozens of infant bodies were found in the river. The jury found Dyer guilty in about 4 minutes and hanged her in 1896. Then there was the married couple who planned to kill the wife's old lover, Marie Manning, to steal her money and run away. They were detained in 1849 and publicly hung simultaneously. Charles Dickens, a prominent author, was present and vehemently criticized the spectacle in a letter to the newspaper The Times after the execution. A character in the book Bleak House that he later created was inspired by his wife. Jack the Ripper. The earliest and most well-known serial killer of the time was named Jack the Ripper. It has been 134 years since violent murders rocked the Whitechapel neighborhood and the rest of London with fear and uncertainty. Nobody has ever been able to determine who committed such atrocities or why, even more than a century later, because no one has ever been able to identify Jack the Ripper and is likely never to. His tale will remain a legend. Jack the Ripper stands out above other horrifying murders because it intrigues and obsesses us in a way that some people are still searching for answers to the mystery. The only thing that is known about him is that over just 70 days, he killed 5 women from the same neighborhood by slitting their necks and removing their organs. The body of Mary Ann Nichols was discovered in Bucks Row, a run-down section of Whitechapel, early on August 31, 1888. At the time, the authorities were unaware she would only be the first, so they cut open her abdomen and sliced her throat. 8 days later, Annie Chapman, who had been seen with a friendly-looking man an hour earlier, reappeared with 2 throat wounds identical to those of the previous victim, her abdomen stabbed and her uterus removed. It took a few weeks before Jack killed 2 more people in a single night, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. The former had wounds identical to the previous victims, but there were no abdominal incisions, raising the question of whether the murderer was the Ripper or whether it had been interrupted. Eddowes was discovered with her throat slit and without a kidney or uterus just 45 minutes later. The last of these unfortunate women was Mary Jane Kelly, who was discovered on her bed with all her organs spread around the floor and a wound running from her throat to her spine. However, in the end, nothing could be done because Jack the Ripper's identity was never revealed, and justice would never be served for the deaths of these 5 unfortunate women. What do you think of these punishments? Comment below with your thoughts on this, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please enable the notification bell when you're there to ensure you receive all our upcoming uploads.